This presentation explores how alcohol laws were applied and interpreted in early 20th century Gaston County, North Carolina. Rather than focusing only on what the law required on paper, this case study examines how those laws functioned in everyday life through local court records. This allows us to move beyond theory and see how individuals actually interacted with the legal system. This example is but a small illustration of how the Gaston County reaction to prohibition measures was not entirely one-sided. While prohibition laws aimed to restrict alcohol, these records suggest that enforcement and community attitudes were more complex. Using these preserved documents, I will show how drugstores sold alcohol under the label of medicine and how the legal system responded to those actions. During this period, selling alcohol without a license was illegal in North Carolina. These laws were part of a broader temperance and prohibition movements that sought to limit alcohol consumption. However, the law also included exceptions, particularly for medical use. Alcohol could be sold as part of medicinal treatments, often under the supervision of a physician. This created a system that was difficult to enforce in practice because it required authorities to distinguish between legitimate medical use and disguised alcohol sales. Preserved court records used here allow us to see how these laws actually functioned at the local level, which is a key focus of public history. These cases were handled by grand juries, which played a central role in the legal process. A grand jury would review evidence, hear witness testimony, and determine whether there was enough evidence to bring a case to trial. If the jury approved the case, it was called a true bill. If they rejected it, it was marked not a true bill, meaning the case would not proceed further. This system placed significant authority in the hands of local citizens, rather than professional judges alone. As a result, the enforcement of laws could reflect community attitudes, values, and priorities rather than a strict legal interpretation. This document shows a case involving the Dallas Drug Company, where a customer purchased Peruna. At first glance, this appears to be a normal commercial transaction within a drugstore. Peruna was widely marketed as a medicinal tonic, and its sale would not necessarily seem suspicious. However, this transaction resulted in a criminal indictment for selling liquor without a license. This indicates that authorities viewed the sale as more than a simple medical purchase. It is important to recognize that drugstores like the Dallas Drug Company were trusted institutions within their communities. Customers would have viewed these transactions as legitimate purchases rather than illegal activity. This makes it more difficult to determine where the line between lawful commerce and criminal behavior was actually drawn in practice. What was Peruna? Peruna was advertised as a medical tonic, often promoted as a remedy for a wide range of ailments. Its marketing emphasized health benefits and positioned it as a legitimate medical product. However, it contained a high percentage of alcohol, sometimes comparable to traditional alcoholic beverages. Because of this, many people consumed it not only for supposed medical benefits, but also for its intoxicating effects. This dual identity made it difficult for authorities to determine whether its sale was legal medicine or illegal alcohol. In many ways, products like Peruna highlight the limitations of prohibition efforts. Even as laws attempted to restrict alcohol, These types of products provided an alternative that was legally ambiguous but widely accessible. This suggests that demand for alcohol did not disappear, but instead shifted into different forms. The legal loophole. The law attempted to regulate alcohol by allowing it to be sold for medical purposes, often requiring a prescription or professional oversight. In theory, this created a clear boundary between legal and illegal sales. In practice, however, this boundary was difficult to enforce. Drugstores could sell alcohol-based products under the label of medicine, even when they were being used as substitutes for liquor. This created a legal loophole that allowed these transactions to continue despite prohibition efforts. Pattern of sales. These documents show repeated transactions involving the same individuals. The recurrence of names suggests that these were not isolated or accidental purchases. Instead, they appear to represent an ongoing pattern of sales, possibly indicating regular customers and repeated access to these products. This pattern suggests that both buyers and sellers understood how to operate within the legal system, taking advantage of the ambiguity surrounding medicinal alcohol. It also raises questions about how widespread these practices were within the community. This practice was not limited to a single business. The Adams Drug Company was also indicted for selling Peruna and Hostetter's bitters, another alcohol-based tonic. The inclusion of multiple products further demonstrates how common alcohol-based medicines were in the marketplace. The involvement of multiple drugstores suggests that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern across Gaston County. The inclusion of both Peruna and Hostetter's bitters in these cases is especially significant. These were not obscure or rare products, but widely recognized and heavily marketed tonics. Their presence in multiple indictments suggests that authorities were aware of this issue, but struggled to consistently enforce regulations against it. Despite the evidence presented in these cases, the grand jury returned a not a true bill, meaning the case did not proceed to trial. This does not mean that the actions did not occur, but rather that the jury did not find sufficient reason to prosecute. The repeated appearance of this outcome suggests that local juries may have been reluctant to enforce these laws strictly. This may reflect broader community attitudes toward alcohol consumption and the perceived legitimacy of medicinal products like Peruna. The decision to return a not a true bill is particularly revealing. It suggests that even when evidence was presented, local juries were not always convinced that these actions warranted prosecution. This may reflect a disconnect between formal legal expectations and the everyday realities of community behavior, where the use of alcohol-based medicines was normalized. In this sense, the jury's decision becomes just as important as the law itself in understanding how prohibition functioned locally. These cases reveal a gap between law and practice in early 20th century Gaston County. While alcohol laws existed and were enforced to some degree, their application depended heavily on local interpretation and community attitudes. Drugstores operated within a gray area, selling products that were both medicine and alcohol, which complicated enforcement efforts. More broadly, this case demonstrates that prohibition was not simply a matter of laws being passed and enforced uniformly. Instead, it involved ongoing negotiation between lawmakers, businesses, and local communities. By examining these preserved records, we gain insight not only into what the law intended, but how people adapted to, interpreted, and sometimes resisted those restrictions in everyday life.